Yonder music.
Hey y'all, what's happening? Welcome to Storytime with Julian. It is Tuesday, January is it the 26th? I done got the dates all mixed up already. I mean, hey, we doing good. A lot of us just to know what day of the week it is. Some of us still sorting out what year it is, and that's all right too. What's good, everybody? Good to see you. Glad you're here. This week we are doing a continuation of last week's story. So the story that we read on on Thursday was Miss Muriel from Miss Muriel and Other Stories. This wonderful book by Ann Petry. And in we read last week, we read the foreword, which was written by Ms. Jamila Lemieux, who posed some really interesting questions about why it is that we have not heard of Miss Petry. Some of us have, but she is not mentioned in that echelon of creatives like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, who were her contemporaries of the Harlem Renaissance period. She eschewed the spotlight, but at the same time, there's some question as to still why have her works not emerged the way some of these others have? Why was there such a long gap between reproductions of her works? And somebody is straight up sending me a video message right now, which I'm almost certain is an accident. You know what? Let's see what happens. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so that was an accident. Because I was sure enough going to be like, you know what? Everybody get to have this conversation. If you're going to call me while I'm on the show and you know it's my showtime, why not? Why not? Everybody can have a piece of this conversation. Anyway, y'all. So we read the first half of the story. Now, for those of you all who need a little bit of a refresher, or maybe you weren't there for the first half, but you just want to hear the last half and you don't so much mind spoilers, let me tell you what we're talking about. So the story takes place in a small town. It's a largely white enclave, and but the lead character, our protagonist, is a little black girl. Now, we don't know her name, but we have reasons to believe that her name is Muriel, and that is because of some context that was dropped earlier in the story, and because the name of the story is Miss Muriel. And when she talks about one of the characters, she says that this character always has a tendency to put Miss in front of her name. So we've got that. Now, Miss Muriel is a very precocious, very bright young lady, and she is very, very self-possessed and self-aware. She is among this group of plucky, spunky girls that we've been reading lately. Tony K. Bambara has been giving us girls from this with this sort of mindset. We got some from N.K. Jemisin. We got some from a little bit in who else did we just read? In Edwidge Dandicat's work, we've gotten a little bit of it, and we're getting some here. And so this plucky particular girl who doesn't take any guff off anybody and is definitely not going to let grown folks just run roughshod over her, has a particularly interesting distinction in this story that we've read thus far, that she is really, really clear about Black folk space, and Black folk space being Black folk space. And she does not have a problem telling Mr. Beamish, who is a grown white man who he's a cobbler. He does shoe repair, and her family does a lot of walking, so they need a lot of shoe repair. And Mr. Beamish has taken a fancy to her aunt, and at one point just invites himself into their backyard to sit with her. And Miss Muriel doesn't like that one bit, and she's got no problem letting Mr. Beamish know this. Now, Mr. Beamish doesn't really seem to know how to take that, and he's a little put off by the fact that she has such confidence, maybe he would even call it gall, to tell him where he does and does not belong. But he doesn't get angry about it, or at least we haven't seen him get angry about it yet. Now, the thing about Miss Muriel's aunt, her aunt is Aunt Sophronia. Aunt Sophronia is beautiful. We're talking Egyptian queen beautiful. We're talking goddess look beautiful. Like she's literally got a golden glow about her. The light seems to find its way to her, kind of situation. So Beamish's crush, you know, all the politics of the day, and we're talking about the early 40s here, maybe even earlier than that. All the politics of the day notwithstanding, Bemis's crush is understandable. This is he's willing to risk it all. Okay, he's got whatever George W. Bush has for Michelle Obama. He's got that. He's willing to risk it all. And so we might see what that risk ends up being, because in addition to Mr. Beamish, there is another figure, uh, a musician who has a certain swagger and air, and there's a little bit of darkness around him. He's got an air of mystery, and this dude's name is Chink Johnson. Chink Johnson plays piano over by the juke joint, and he has also set his eyes on Aunt Sophronia. And Chink Johnson seems to have won thus far. And of the two suitors, young Miss Muriel, has decided that even though she doesn't quite trust him, doesn't quite get him, she prefers Chink Johnson over Mr. Beamish. And as she's trying to unpack why, and this is, a long time ago, and this is a 12-year-old girl who's doing this kind of advanced thinking about it. As she's trying to unpack why, she realizes that she has some ideas and some notions about race that she doesn't know where she got trained in. She doesn't know where she learned them. She just has them. And that's the last thought that she expresses before we left off last week. So I'm going to reread that piece, and we will get into what happens next. All right. So from Miss Muriel and Other Stories, this is part 2 of Miss Muriel. Pyong, part 2 of Miss Muriel. I have thought a great deal about Mr. Beamish. I like him. He is truly a friend. But I do not think he should be interested in my Aunt Sophronia, at least not in a loving kind of way. The thing that bothers me is that I honestly cannot decide whether I object to him as a suitor to her because he is white or because he is old. Sometimes I think it's for both reasons. I'm fairly certain it isn't just because he's old. This bothers me. If my objections to him are because he's white, and that's what I told him, but I often say things that I know people don't want to hear and that they particularly do not want to hear from someone very much younger than they are, then I have been trained on the subject of race, just as I have been trained to be a Christian. I know how I was trained to be a Christian, Sunday school, prayers, etc. I do not know exactly how I've been trained on the subject of race. Then why do I feel this about Mr. Beamish? Shortly after I wrote that, I stopped puzzling about Mr. Beamish because summer officially started, at least for me. It is true that school has been out for a long time and we are wearing our summer clothes and the yard is filled with flowers, but summer never really gets underway for me until Doddle Smith comes for his yearly visit. Doddle and Uncle Jono went to school together. They look sort of alike. They are big men and they are so light in color that they look like white men. But something in them, Doddle says that it is a cultivated and developed and carefully nourished hatred of white men, will not permit them to pass for white. Doddle teaches English and elocution and dramatics at a school for Black people in Georgia, and he gives lectures and readings during the summer to augment his income. Uncle Jono is the chief fundraising agent for a Black school in Louisiana. I believe that my attitude toward Mr. Beamish stems from Doddle Smith and Jono. They are both what my father calls race conscious. When they travel on trains in the South, they ride in Jim Crow coaches until the conductor threatens to have them arrested unless they sit in the sections of the train reserved for whites. They are always being put out of the black sections of waiting rooms and warned out of the black sections of towns, and being refused lodgings in black rooming houses on the grounds that they would be a sort of embarrassment. Nobody would be able to figure out why a white man wanted to live with black people, and they would be suspected of being spies, but of what kind or to what purpose they have never been able to determine. But of what kind or to what purpose they have never been able to determine. I have just reread what I have written here, and I find that I've left out the reason why I'm writing so much about Doddle. Yesterday afternoon, when I came back from an errand, there was a large, heavy-looking bag, leather, but it was shaped like a carpet bag, near the bench where the customers sit when they wait for their prescriptions. I recognized it immediately. I have seen that bag every summer for as far back as I can remember. I wondered if Doddle had come alone this time or if he had a friend with him. Sometimes he brings a young man with him. These young men look very much alike. They're always slender, rather shy, have big dark eyes and very smooth skin, just about the color of bamboo. I looked at Doddle's big battered old bag sitting on the floor near the bench, and I could almost see him with his long curly hair, and I could hear him reciting poetry in his rich, buttery voice. He can quote all the great speeches from Hamlet, Macbeth, Richard II, and he can recite the sonnets. I loved him. He was lively and funny and unexpected. Sometimes he would grab my braid and shout in his best Shakespearean voice, "Seize on her furies! Take her to your torments!" I looked at Doddle's battered bag and I said to my father, "Is he alone? Or has he got one of those pretty boys with him?" My father looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Alone. How come he to leave his bag here?" "Well, the Eccles aren't home. Ellen's gone on vacation." "Why does Aunt Ellen always go on vacation when Doddle comes?" My father ignored this and went on talking. "Jono's gone to Albany collecting money for the school." "Where's Doddle now?" "I'm right here, sugar," said Doddle Smith, and opened the screen door and came in. He looked bigger than he had the summer before. He hugged me. He smelled faintly of lavender. "You went and grew, honey," he said, and took off his hat and bowed. It was a wide-brimmed Panama, and he had on a starched white shirt and a flowing Byronic kind of black tie. And I looked at him with absolute delight. He was being a Southern Cunnel, and he was such an actor. I thought I could see lace at his wrists, hear mockingbirds sing, see a white columned mansion, hear hoofbeats in the distance, and hear a long line of slaves, suitably clad as footmen and coachmen and butlers and housemen, murmur, "Yes, massa, yes, massa." It was all there in his voice. "Why, in another couple of years, I'll be reciting poetry to you. How's your mama? This summer I'll have to teach you how to talk. These Yankee teachers you've got talk all through their noses. They got you doing the same thing." For 2 whole days, I forgot about Chink Johnson and Mr. Beamish and Aunt Sophronia. Doddle liked to go fishing and crabbing, and he liked to play whist, and he could tell the most marvelous stories and act them out. The very next day, Doddle and Uncle Jono and I went crabbing. We set out early in the morning with our nets and our fishing lines and the rotten meat we used for bait, and our lunch in thermos bottles with lemonade in them. It was a 2-mile walk from where we lived to the creek where we caught crabs. There was a bridge across the creek, an old wooden bridge. Some of the planks were missing. We stood on this bridge, or sat on it, and threw our lines in the water. Once in a great while, a horse and wagon would drive across and set the planks to vibrating. Jono and Doddle would hop off the bridge, but I stayed on and held on to the railing. The bridge trembled under my feet, and the horse and wagon would thunder across, and the driver usually waved and hollered, "I gotta go fast or we'll all fall in." The water in the creek was so clear I could see big crabs lurking way down on the bottom. I could see little pieces of white shells and beautiful stones. We didn't talk much while we were crabbing. Sometimes I lay flat on my stomach on the bridge and looked down into the water, watching the little eddies and whirlpools that formed after I threw my line in. Before we ate our lunch, we went wading in the creek. Jono and Dottle rolled up the legs of their pants, and their legs were so wide I wondered if they were white all over, and if they were, how they could be called black. We sat on the bank of the creek and ate our lunch. Afterward, Dottle and Jono told stories, wonderful stories in which animals talk and there are haunted houses and ghosts and demons and old black preachers who believe in heaven and hell. They always started off the same way. Dottle would say to Jono, "Mr. Bones, be seated." Though I've heard some of these stories many, many times, Dottle and Jono never tell them exactly the same. They change their gestures, they vary their facial expressions and the pitch of their voices. Dottle almost always tells the story about the black man who goes into a store in a small town in the South and asks for Muriel cigars. The white man who now own the white man who owns the store says, and here Jono becomes an outraged Southern white man, "Nigger, what's the matter with you? Don't you see that picture of a beautiful white woman on this front of this box? When you ask for them cigars, you say, Miss Muriel cigars." Though Uncle Jono is a good storyteller, he is not as good, not as funny, or dramatic as Dottle. When I listen to Dottle, I can see the old black preacher who spent the night in a haunted house. I see him approaching the house, the wind blowing his coattails, and finally him taking refuge inside because of the violence of the storm. He lights a fire in the fireplace and sits down by it and rubs his hands together, warming them. As he sits there, he hears heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, and Dottle makes his hands go thump, thump, thump on the bank of the creek. And the biggest cat the old man has ever seen comes in and sits down and looks at the old preacher, looks around, and says, "Has Martin got here yet?" The old man is too startled and too nervous to answer. He hears heavy footsteps again, thump, 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 and the second cat, much bigger than the first one, comes in and sits down right next to the old preacher. Both cats stare at him, and then the second cat says to the first cat, "Has Martin got here yet?" And the first cat shakes his head. There's something so speculative in their glance that the old man gets more and more uneasy. He wonders if they are deciding to eat him. The wind howls in the chimney, puffs of smoke blow back into the room. Then another bigger cat thumps down the stairs. Finally, there are 6 enormous cats, 3 on each side of him. Each one of these cats has asked the same question of the others. "Martin got here yet?" A stair-shaking tread begins at the top of the stairs. The cats all look at each other, and the old man grabs his hat and says to the assembled cats, "You tell Martin I've been here, but I've gone." I clapped when Donald finished this story. I looked around thinking how glad I am he is here and what a wonderful place this is to listen to stories. The sun is warm, but there is a breeze, and it blows through the long marsh grass which borders the creek. The grass moves, seems to wave. Gulls fly high overhead. The only sound is the occasional cry of a gull and the lapping of water against the piling of the bridge. Jono tells the next story. It is about an old black preacher and a rabbit. The old man tries to outrun an overly friendly and very talkative rabbit. The rabbit keeps increasing in size. The old man runs away from him and the rabbit catches up with him. Each time the rabbit says, "That was some fun we had, wasn't it, brother?" Finally, the old man runs until he feels as though his lungs are going to burst and his legs will turn to rubber, and he looks back and doesn't see the rabbit anywhere in his sight. He sits down on a stone to rest and catch his breath. He has just seated himself when he discovers the rabbit sitting right beside him, smiling. The rabbit is now the same size as the preacher. The rabbit rolls his eyes and lisps, "That was some fun we had, wasn't it?" The old man stood up. got ready to run again and said, "Yes, that was some run we had, brother, but," he took a deep breath, "you ain't seen no running yet." After they finished telling the story, we all took naps. Dottle and Jono were wearing old straw hats, wide-brimmed Panamas with crooked floppy brims. Dottle had attached a piece of mosquito netting to his, and it hung down across his shoulders. From the back, he looked like a woman who was wearing a veil. When we woke up, it was late in the afternoon and time to start for home. I ran part of the way. Then I sat down by the side of the road in the shade and waited until they caught up with me. Dottle said, "Sugar, what are you in such a hurry for?" I said, laughing, "Miss Muriel, you tell Martin I've been here, but I've gone, and he ain't seen no running yet." I got home first. Chink Johnson was in the store. When Dottle and Jono arrived, I introduced Chink to my uncles, Jono and Dottle. They didn't seem much impressed with each other. Jono nodded and Dottle smiled and left. Chink watched Dottle as he went toward the back room. Dottle has a very fat bottom and he sort of sways side to side as he walks. Chink said, "He seems kind of ladylike. He related on your mother's side?" "He's not related at all. He's an old friend of Uncle Jono's. They went to school together in Atlanta, Georgia." I sounded very condescending. "Do you know where that is?" "Yeah. Nigga, read this. Nigga, don't let sundown catch you here. Nigga, if you can't read this, run anyway. If you can't run, then vanish. Just vanish out. I know the place. I came from there." My father was standing outside on the walk talking to Aunt Frank, so I felt at liberty to speak freely, and I said, "Nigga, what are you talking about? You want Muriel cigars. You see this picture of this beautiful red-headed white woman, nigga? You say Miss Muriel." Chink stood up and he was frowning and his voice was harsh. "Little girl, don't you talk that way. I talk that way if I feel like it, but don't you ever talk that way." I felt as though I had been betrayed. One moment he was my friend and we were speaking as equals, and the next moment, without warning, he is an adult who is scolding me in a loud, harsh voice. I was furious, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. This made me angrier. I couldn't seem to control my weeping. Recently, and I do not know how it happened, whenever I'm furiously angry, I begin to cry. Chink leaned over and put his hand under my chin, lifted my face, saw the tears, and he kissed my cheek. His beard was rough and scratchy. He smelled like the pine woods, and I could see pine needles in his hair and in his beard, and I wondered if he and Aunt Sophronia had been in the woods. "Sugar," he said gently, "I don't like that Miss Muriel story. It ought to be told the other way around. A black man should be telling a white man, 'White man, you see this picture of this beautiful black woman? White man, you say Miss Muriel.'" He went out of the store through the back room into the yard, just as though he were a member of the family. It hadn't taken him very long to reach this position. Almost every afternoon he goes for a walk with Aunt Sophronia. I watch them when they leave the store. He has his head bent so that his face is close to hers. Once I met them strolling up Petticoat Lane, his dark face so close to hers that his goat's beard was touching her smooth brown cheek. My mother used to watch them too, as they walked side by side on the dirt path that led to the woods, miles and miles of woods. Sometimes he must have said things that Aunt Sophronia didn't like because she would turn up her head sharply away from him. I decided that once you got used to his beard and the peculiar color and slant of his eyes, why, you could say he had an interesting face. I do not know what it is about his eyes that makes me think of heat, but I know what color they are. They are the color of petrified wood after it's being polished. It's a red brown, and that's what his eyes are like. I like the way he plays the piano, though I do not like his voice. I cannot get my mother to talk about him. My father grunts when I mention Chink's name and scowls so ferociously that it is obvious he does not like him. I tried to find out what Aunt Sophronia thought of him. Later in the day, I found her in the store alone and I said, "Do you like Chink Johnson?" She said, "Run along and do the supper dishes." "But do you?" Don't ask personal questions, she said, and her face and neck flushed. She must have liked him, though. She not only went on walking with him in the afternoon, but on Sunday mornings he went to church with her. He wore a white linen suit and that same stiff straw hat way back on his head. He brought her presents: a tall bottle of violet eau de cologne, a bunch of Parma violets made of silk, but they looked real. On Sundays, Aunt Sophronia wore the violets pinned at her wrist, and they made her look elegant, like a picture in a book. I said, "Oh, you look beautiful." My mother said, dryly, "Very stylish." We all crossed the street together on Sunday mornings. They went to church. I went to Sunday school. Sunday school was out first, and I waited for them down on the church steps to come down the church steps. Aunt Sophronia came down the church steps, and he would be so close behind her that he might have been dancing with her and matching his leg movements to hers. Suddenly, he was in front of her and down on the path before she was, and he turned and held out his hand. Even there on the sidewalk, he wasn't standing still. It was as though his feet and hands are more closely connected to his heart, to his central nervous system, than is true of other people. So that during every waking moment he moves, tapping his foot on the floor, tapping his fingers on a railing or somebody's arm, on a tabletop. I wondered if he kept moving like that when he was asleep, tapping quarter notes with his foot, playing eighth notes with his right hand, half notes with his left hand. He attacked the piano when he played it, violated it. Violate a piano? I thought. Violate Aunt Sophronia? He stood on the dirt path and held out his hand to Aunt Sophronia, smiling, helping her down the church steps. "Get your prayers said, sugar?" he said to me. "Yes. I said one for you and one for the family. Aunt Sophronia, you smell delicious, like violets." "She does, doesn't she?" We walked across the street to the drugstore hand in hand. Chink was in the middle, and he held one of my hands and one of Aunt Sophronia's. He stays for dinner on Sundays, and on Sunday nights, we close the store early and we all sit in the backyard where it is cool. Mr. Beamish joins us in the yard. At dusk, the fireflies come out, and then as the darkness deepens, bats swoop around us. Aunt Sophronia says, "Ooh," and holds on to her head, afraid one might get entangled in her hair. Doddle took out one of his big white handkerchiefs and tied it around his head, and he said in his richest, most buttery voice, "One of the nocturnal or crepuscular flying mammals constituting the order Cyprodot." Damn it, I actually know this word. Hold on. One of the nocturnal or crepuscular flying mammals constituting the order Chiroptera. Doddle sprawled in the chair and recited poetry or told long stories about the South, stories that sometimes had so much fear and terror and horror in them that we shivered even though the air was warm. Chink didn't spend the evening. He sat in one of the old lawn chairs, tapping on the arm with his long, flexible fingers, and then left. Mr. Beamish always stays until we've gone in for the night. He takes no part in the conversation, but sits on the ground, huddled near Aunt Sophronia's skirts. Once, when a bat swooped quite close, Aunt Sophronia clutched his arm. Sometimes Doddle recites whole acts from Macbeth or Hamlet, or all of Song of Solomon, or sometimes he recites the loveliest of Shakespeare's sonnets. We forget about the bat swooping over our heads, ignore the mosquitoes that sting our ankles and our legs, and sit mesmerized while he declaims, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" The summer is going faster and faster, perhaps because of the presence of Aunt Sophronia's suitors. I don't suppose Doddle is really a suitor, but he goes through the motions. He picks little bouquets for her, bachelor buttons and candy tuft, and leaves them on the kitchen table. He always calls her Miss Sophronia. If we are outdoors and she comes out to sit in the yard, he leaps to his feet and bows and says, wait, before you sit on that bench, let me wipe it off." And he pulls out an enormous linen handkerchief and wipes off the bench. He is always bowing and kissing her hand. By the middle of August, it was very hot. My father had the store painted, and when the blinds were taken down, the painter found whole families of bats clinging together in the back of the blinds. Evidently, they lived there. I couldn't get hold of one, although I tried. They were the most peculiar looking creatures. They looked almost like a person who wears glasses all the time and then suddenly goes without them. They have kind of a peering look. Chink Johnson is always in our house or in the store or in the yard or going for walks with Aunt Sophronia. Whenever he is not violating the piano at the inn, he is with Aunt Sophronia. He taught her how to dance in the backyard without any music, just his counting and clapping his hands. His feet made no sound on our thick grass. On 2 different sunny afternoons, he gave her dancing lessons, and on the third afternoon, he had her dancing. She was laughing and she was lively looking, and she looked young. He persuaded her to take off her shoes, and she danced in her bare feet. Fortunately, nobody knows this but me. He took her fishing. When they came back, she was quite sunburned, but her eyes were shining as though they held reflective light from the sun shining on water. Just in that one short summer, he seemed to take on all kinds of guises: fisherman, dancer, singer, churchgoer, even delivery boy. One morning, someone knocked at the back door, and there was Chink Johnson with our grocery order, saying to my Aunt Sophronia, "Here's your meat, ma'am, and your vegetables," touching his hat, bowing, unloading the crate of groceries, and then sitting down at the kitchen table as though he owned it, drinking a cup of coffee that no one had offered him, just pouring it out of the enamel pot that stays on the stove, finding cream and sugar himself, and sitting there with his legs thrust way out in front of him and those terribly tight pants he wears looking as though they were painted on his thighs. Sometimes when he sits in our kitchen, he laughs. His laughter is not merry. When my father laughs, the sound makes you laugh, even when you don't know what he's laughing about. When Chink Johnson laughs, I look away from him. The sound hurts my ears. It's like the ugly squawk of some big bird that you have disturbed in the woods, and it flies right into your face, pecking at your eyes. It has been a very interesting summer. I have begun to refer to it in the past tense because there isn't much left of summer by the middle of August. One Thursday afternoon, Aunt Sophronia and I saw the other ladies like Chink Johnson too. Thursday afternoon is traditionally Maid's Day off, and Chink Johnson drove the maids from the inn into the town in a wagon late in the day. He stopped in front of the store with a wagon full of girls in long skirts, giggling, leaning against him, a kind of panting excitement in that wagon. Their arms around him, they whispered to him. They were seized by fits of laughter, shrieks of laughter. They came in the store and bought hair nets and hairpins and shampoo and Vaseline and hair tonics and cough medicines and court plaster and a great many other items that they did not need because it was a pleasure to be spending money and to be free of the tyranny of the housekeeper's demands. Or so my mother said. Some young and attractive, some not so young. About 10 of them. Aunt Sophronia was in the store and she waited on them, studying them. Every once in a while, one would go to the door and yell, "We'll be out in a minute, Chink, just a little while," and wave at him and throw kisses at him. Then they were gone, all at once, piling into the wagon, long, full skirts in disarray. One of them sat in Chink's lap, laughing, looking up into his face, and saying, "Let's go into the woods, Chink. Take us in the woods. I'll help drive." Aunt Sophronia and I stood in the doorway and watched them as they drove off, going toward the pine woods. The wagon seemed to be filled with wide skirts and ruffled petticoats, all suddenly upended because Chink said, "Get up there," and hit the horse with the whip, cracked it over the horse's ears, and the horse started off as though he were a racehorse. It was late when they went past the store going home. Sitting in the backyard, we could hear the horse racing and the girl squealing and laughing, and Chink singing a ribald song about strolling and strolling. Doddle stopped right in the middle of a poem, and Mr. Bemis straightened up so that he was not quite so close to Aunt Sophronia's skirts. It was like having Chink Johnson right there in the backyard with us. The rough atonal voice, the red-brown eyes that looked hot, literally hot, as though if you touched them, you would have to withdraw your fingers immediately because they would be scorched or singed or burned. The jutting beard, the restless feet and hands. We sat absolutely still. We could hear the rattling of the wagon, the clop clop of the horses' hooves, and above it the laughter of the girls. And dominating that sound, Chink Johnson's voice lifted in song. Even after they were so far away we could not possibly hear them, the sound seemed to linger in the air, faint and far off. It was a warm night, brilliant with light from the woods. Nope. It was a warm night, brilliant with light from the moon. I pictured the girl sitting on top of Chink, all around him, on his arms, in his lap, on his shoulder, and I thought the prettiest one should be perched on his head. Dottle lit a cigar and puffed out clouds of bluish smoke and said, "I never heard the mating call of the male so clearly sounded on a summer's night." He laughed so hard that he had to get out one of his big handkerchiefs and dab his eyes with it. Aunt Sophronia got up from the bench so fast that she brushed against Mr. Beamish, almost knocking him over. He lost his balance and regained it only because he supported himself with one hand on the ground. She must have known that she had nearly upset him, but she went marching up toward the house, her back very straight and her head up in the air, and she never once looked back. Dottle said, "Have I offended her?" My mother said, "It's late. It's time we went in." Mr. Beamish must have gone home when we went in the house, but he was in the backyard so early the next morning he might as well have just spent the night. Dottle and I were standing in the kitchen looking down at the backyard. He was drinking coffee out of a mug, and I was eating a piece of bread and butter. Our backyard is a pretty sight on summer morning. It is filled with flowers and birds are singing, and the air is very cool. And there is a special smell, a summer smell, compounded of grass and dew on the grass and flowers and the suggestion of heat to come later in the day. We looked out the door, and there was Mr. Beamish down on his knees in front of Aunt Sophronia. He was sitting on the bench, and she was sitting on the bench, and she looked horrified, and she seemed to have been in the act of trying to stop him, one hand extended in a thrusting motion. I thought, his pant legs will be very damp because there's still dew on the grass. And how did he get here so early? And did he know she would be sitting on the bench before almost sunup? "Ah, girlie, girlie," he said on his knees in our backyard, kneeling on our thick, soft grass. "Will you marry me?" "No." "Is it," he said, "because I am old?" And his voice went straight up in pitch like a scale. "I am not old. I'm not old. Why, I can still jump in the air and click my heels together 3 times. And he did. He got up off his knees, and he jumped up, straight up, and clicked his heels together 3 times and landed on the grass, and there was just a slight thumping sound when he landed. Aunt Sophronia said, Mr. Beamish, don't do that. Don't do that. Go away, go home." And she ran toward the house, and he started after her, and then he saw us standing in the door watching him, and he stood still. He shouted after her, "I'll put on my best coat and my best hat, and you won't know me. I'll be back, and you won't know me." Dottle glared at him through the screen door and said, "You old fool. You old fool." Mr. Beamish hurried around the side of the house, pretending that he hadn't heard him. I did not know when Mr. Beamish would be back, wearing his best coat and his best hat, but I certainly wanted to see him, and if possible, to witness his next performance. I decided that whoever Aunt Sophronia was in the store, whenever Aunt Sophronia was in the store, I'd be in the store too. When my father went to eat his dinner at 12:30, Aunt Sophronia looked after the store. There weren't many people who came in at that hour. It was the dinner hour, and Aunt Sophronia sat in the prescription room with the door open and reading the morning newspaper. There was an old wooden chair by the window in the prescription room. It had a faded painting across the back, a wooden seat and back and arms. It was a very comfortable chair if you sat up straight, and Aunt Sophronia sat up very straight. She could look out the window and see the church green, see the path that went up Petticoat Lane toward the pine woods. and she commanded a view of the interior of the store. I don't think she saw Mr. Beamish when he entered. If she had, she would have gotten out of the chair immediately to wait on him. But she was reading the newspaper, and he came in very quietly. He was wearing a cutaway coat that was too long, and a pair of striped trousers, and he was carrying a silk hat in his hand, a collapsed silk hat. He stopped inside the door and put the hat in shape, and then placed it carefully on his head. He looked like a circus clown who was making fun of the ringmaster, mocking him, making his costume look silly. Mr. Beamish went straight through the store and stood in front of Aunt Sophronia, and he jumped up straight in the air like a dancer and clicked his heels together 3 times. The bottles on the shelves rattled, and the back room was filled with a pinging sound. "Oh, my goodness," Aunt Sophronia said, frowning. "Oh, my goodness, don't jump like that." And she stood up. My father came in through the back door, and he said, "What's going on here? What's going on in here?" Mr. Beamish said, "I was just showing Miss Sophronia that I can still jump up in the air and click my heels together 3 times before I come back down again." My father made a noise that sounded like boo, but wasn't quite, and Mr. Beamish retreated, talking very fast. I had asked Miss Sophronia if she would marry me, and she said no, and I thought perhaps it was because she thinks I'm too old and not stylish enough, and so I got dressed up, and I was showing her I could still jump. Get out of here! Get out of here! Get out of here!" My father's voice kept rising and increasing in volume, and his face looked as though he were about to burst. It seemed to darken and to swell, to get bigger. Aunt Sophronia said, "Oh, you mustn't talk to him like that." My father was moving toward Mr. Beamish, and Mr. Beamish was retreating, and finally he turned and ran out of the store and ran up Petticoat Lane with his long coattails flapping about his legs. My father said, "I shouldn't have let him hang around all these months. I can't leave the store for 5 minutes that I don't find one of those no-goods hanging around when I come back. Not one of them worth the powder to shoot and blow in the hell and back. That piano player pawing the ground, and this old white man jumping up in the air, and that friend of Jono's, that poet or whatever he is. All he needs is some starched petticoats and a bonnet, and he'd make a woman. He's practically one now, and he's tee-heeing around. And if they were all put together in one piece, it still wouldn't be a whole man." My father shook his fist in the air and glared at Aunt Sophronia. I guess it's all my fault." Aunt Sophronia sounded choked up and funny. My father said, No, I didn't mean that," and patted her arm. "It's all perfectly natural. It's just that we're the only black people living in this little bit of town, and there aren't any fine young black men around. Only this tramp piano player, and every time I look at him, I can hear him playing some rags and see a whole line of big-bosomed women done up in sequin dresses standing over him, moaning about wanting somebody to turn their dampers down. And I can see poker games and crap games, and..." My mother came in through the back room. She said, "Samuel, why are you talking about gambling games?" "I was trying to explain to Sophie how I feel about that piano player." To my surprise, my mother said, "Has Sophronia asked you how you feel about Mr. Johnson?" When my father shook his head, she said, "Then I don't think there's any reason for you to say anything about him. I need you in the garden. I want you to move one of my peonies." I wonder what my mother would say if she knew how my father chased little Mr. Beamish out of his store. I wonder if Mr. Beamish will ever come back. Mr. Beamish did come back. He came back the following Sunday. We were all in the store, Aunt Sophronia, Doddle, and Chink, and I. Mr. Beamish sidled in through the door. He looked as though he expected someone to jump out at him and yell, "Go home." But he came in anyway, and he sat down beside me on the bench near the front of the store. Chink was leaning on the cigar case, talking to Aunt Sophronia, his face very close to hers. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he seemed to be trying to persuade her to do something, go for a walk or something, and she was obviously refusing, politely, but definitely. Doddle was standing near the back of the store, watching Chink. Aunt Frank opened the store door and stood in the doorway holding the screen door open. She has a cross, sharp way of speaking, very fast and very unpleasant. She saw me and said, "Where's Martha?" I wasn't expecting to see Aunt Frank in the store at the hour, and I was surprised that I didn't answer her. And I was so surprised that I didn't answer her. "What's the matter with you? Cat got your tongue? Did you not hear what I said? I said, where's your mother?" "She's over on the other side of the building in the kitchen. She's having coffee with my father." She scowled at Chink. "How long's that bearded man been in here talking to Sophie?" Chink turned around and looked toward Aunt Frank. Aunt Sophronia started toward her, moving very fast out from behind the cigar case, saying, "Can I get something for you?" As Aunt Frank stood there holding the door open, a whole flight of bats came in the store. I say a flight because I don't know what else to call a large-sized group of bats. They swooped down and up in a blind, fast flight. Aunt Frank shrieked, "Ah, my hair! Watch out for your hair! Ah!" and stood up on the bench and held her black fusty skirts close about her and then pulled them up over her head. I decided she had confused mites and bats, that the technique for getting rid of mice was to stand on a chair and clutch one's skirts around one. That is, if you were a lady and pretended to be afraid of mice. I did learn that Aunt Frank was wearing carpet slippers made of dark gray felt, black cotton stockings, and under the outside layer of her skirts, there seemed to be a great many layer of black petticoats. Doddle ran into the back room and held the door tightly shut. There's a glass in the door that he could look out the rest of us as we dodged the bats. I could see his large pale face and long hair, and I suppose he was as frightened as Aunt Frank that the bats would get entangled in his hair, because he squealed, all the rich buttery quality gone from his voice, just a high-pitched squealing. Aunt Frank cautiously lowered the outer skirt, fumbled in a pocket, and took out a bottle, not a big bottle, but about the size of an 8-ounce cough medicine bottle, and she took 2 or 3 swigs from it, recorked it, and then recovered her head. Chink grabbed a newspaper and slapped at the bats as they circled. "Gotcha! Ha ha! Gotcha! Ha ha! Gotcha! Ha ha!" And then he folded the newspaper and belted them as they swished past him. Mr. Beamish stared. I decided that he'd lived with bats and spiders and mice. Well, not lived with, perhaps, but was accustomed to them, that he could not understand why they should cause all this noise and confusion and fear. He ignored the bats entirely and went to the rescue of his lady love. He clasped Aunt Sophronia to his bosom, covering her head with his hands and arms, and he kept murmuring comforting words. Now, I won't let anything hurt you. Nothing can harm you." He took a deep breath and said quite distinctly, "I love you, my darling. I love you, love you." Aunt Sophronia seemed to nestle in his arms, to cuddle closer to him, to lean harder every time a bat swooped past them. Father came through the back room. He had to wrestle Doddle out of the way before he could get through the door, and he very sensibly held the screen door open, and with what the impetus offered by Chink's folded newspaper, the bats swooped outside. It was really very exciting while it lasted, what with all the shrieks and the swift movement of the bats. When I began to really look around, the first thing I noticed was that Aunt Sophronia was still huddled in the protective arms of Mr. Beamish. Doddle came out of the back room with his mouth pursed, and his cheeks were puffed out a little, and I wouldn't have been surprised if he had hissed at Mr. Beamish. He and Chink headed straight toward Mr. Beamish. They are very tall men, and Mr. Beamish is short and slender, and as they converged on him, one from the rear and the other from the side, he looked smaller and older than ever. Aunt Sophronia stepped away from Mr. Beamish. She moved toward Chink. One side of her face was red where it had been pressed hard against the wool of Mr. Beamish's coat. All of a sudden, my father's hand was resting on one of Chink's shoulders. He has large, heavy hands, and his hand seemed to have descended suddenly and with great weight. He said, "You'll not start any trouble in my store." Aunt Frank said, "Bats! Bats!" She indicated that my father was to help her down from the bench. She climbed down awkwardly, holding on to him. "Worse than bats," she said, and she made a wide, all-inclusive gesture that took in Chink and Doddle and Mr. Beamish. "Where's Martha?" she demanded. She's still in the kitchen? My father nodded. He held the door open for Mr. Beamish, and Mr. Beamish scuttled out. Dottle and Chink went out too. I found a dead bat on the floor and sat down on the bench at the front of the store to examine it. It had a very unpleasant smell, but it was such an interesting creature that I ignored the odor. It had rather large pointed ears that I thought were quite charming. It had very sharp little claws. I could see why the ladies had screamed and covered their heads, because if those claws got entangled in their long hair, someone would have had to have cut their hair to get a bat out of it. Aunt Frank's hair isn't long. It's like a sheep's wool, tight curled and close to the skin or scalp. But I suppose that a bat's sharp little claws and peculiar wings snarled up in that might create more of a problem than it would if caught in longer and less tightly curled hair. The wings of the bat were webbed like the feet of ducks, with a thin membrane-like tissue that was attached to the body, reaching from the front legs or arms to the back legs and attached to the sides. The body was small in comparison to the wide sweep of those curious wings. I stretched out its wings, and they looked like the inside of an opened umbrella, and I couldn't help admiring them. I began to think of all the things I'd heard said about bats, blind as a bat, and the word batty meaning crazy, and I tried to figure out why batty. Probably because a bat's behavior didn't make sense to a human being. Its fast, erratic flight would look senseless. Then Aunt Frank's voice sounded right in my ear, and her horrible breath was in my nose, and she smelled worse than the bat. She said, "You throw that nasty thing away. You throw that nasty thing away." I thrust the dead bat straight at her black and wrinkled face. "Look out!" I yelled. "It'll suck your blood. It's still alive. Look out." She jumped away, absolutely furious. "You little vixen," she said, and squealed just like a pig. Then she saw my mother standing in the door of the prescription room. "Martha," she commanded, "you come here and make her throw this nasty thing away. Make her throw it away. She's sitting here playing with a dead bat." My mother said, "If you want to look at the bat, take it outside or take it in the back room. You can't keep a dead bat here in the drugstore." "This can't hurt her. It's dead." She interrupted me. "Many people are afraid of bats. It doesn't make any difference whether the bats are dead or alive. They're still afraid of them." I went outside and sat on the front steps and waited. There was a full moon, and the light from it made the street and the houses and the church look as though they had been whitewashed. I put the bat beside me on the step. I was going to wait for Aunt Frank, and when she came out of the store and started down the steps, I was going to put the dead, stinking bat in one of the big pockets in her skirt, the pocket where she kept her bottle of gin. And when she got home and reached for a drink, I hoped she would discover, encounter, touch with her bony fingers the corpse of one of the nocturnal or crepuscular flying mammals as a token of my affection. I must have waited there on the steps for 2 hours. My father began putting out the lights in the store. I stayed right there, anticipating the moment when my ancient enemy, Aunt Frank, would come stumbling around the side of the building. And then, one moment I was sitting on the splintery front steps of the store, and the next moment I was running up Petticoat Lane, going just as fast as I could, because it had suddenly occurred to me that Chink Johnson and Donald Smith had gone out of the drugstore right behind Mr. Beamish, and they hadn't returned. By the time I reached Mr. Beamish's shop, I was panting. I couldn't catch my breath. Mr. Beamish's wagon was drawn up close to the side of the shop. The horse was hitched to it. Mr. Beamish was loading the headboard of his beautiful brass bed on the wagon. He was obviously moving, leaving town at night. He walked in a peculiar fashion as though he were lame. He was panting too, and making hiccuping noises like someone who has been crying for a long time. So long that no real sound comes out, just a kind of hiccuping noise due to the contractions of the throat muscles and the heaving of the chest. As I stood there, he got the headboard on the wagon, and then he struggled with his mattress and then the springs, and then he brought out his cobbler's bench. Dottle and Chink stood watching him, just like 2 guards or 2 sheriffs. None of them said Sorry. Doddle and Chink stood watching him, just like two guards or two sheriffs. None of us said anything. I finally sat down on the enormous millstone that served as Mr. Beamish's front step. I sat way off to the side where I wouldn't interfere with any of his comings and goings. Maya-Ling, his cat, rubbed up against me and then came and sat in my lap, with her back to me, facing toward Mr. Beamish. It didn't take him very long to empty the shop of his belongings. I couldn't help thinking that if we ever moved, it would take us days to pack all the books and pictures and the china and all of our clothes and furniture. We all collected things. Aunt Sophronia did beautiful embroidery and she collected embroidered fabrics. My mother collected old dishes and old furniture. My father collected old glass bottles and old mortars. And they all collected books. And then all the rooms had furniture. And then there were all kinds of cooking pots. None of us would ever get all of his belongings in one wagon. Mr. Beamish came out of the shop and walked all around the little building with that peculiar stiff-legged gait. Apparently, the only item he'd overlooked was his garden bench. He had trouble getting it in the wagon, and I dumped Maya-Ling on the ground and went to help him. One of Doddle's meaty hands gripped my braid. He can manage. I twisted away from him. He's just a little old man, and he's my friend. I'm going to help him. Chink said, "Leave her alone." Doddle let go of my hair. I helped put the bench in the wagon and then went inside the shop with him and helped him carry out the few items that were left. Each time I went into the shop with Mr. Beamish, I asked him questions. We both whispered. "Where are you going, Mr. Beamish?" "Massachusetts." "Why?" He didn't answer. His hiccups got worse. I waited until we'd taken down the green summer curtains and carefully folded them and put them in the little trunk that held some of his clothes and put his broom and his dustpan and his tall kitchen cooking stool on the wagon before I repeated my question. His hiccups had quieted down. "Why are you leaving, Mr. Beamish?" I whispered. "They were going to sew me up." "Sew you up? Did you say sew you up?" "Yes." "Where?" I said, staring at him, thinking, sew up? Sew up what? Eyes, nostrils, mouth, ears, rectum? "They were trying to scare you, Mr. Beamish. Nobody would sew up a person, a human being, unless it was a surgeon, after an operation." He shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I thought so too, but no, they meant it, with my own waxed thread." "Did they?" "Hush, hush." We used this little piece of flowered carpet to wrap his wash bowl and pitcher in, and then put the whole bulky package it made on the wagon. We went back inside to make sure that we hadn't forgotten anything. The inside of his shop looked very small and shabby and lonely. There wasn't anything left except his stove, and he obviously couldn't take that. It was a very big, handsome stove, and he kept it quite shiny and clean. "Can you keep a secret?" he whispered, standing quite close to me. He smelled old and dusty and withered like dry flowers. I nodded. He handed me a small velvet bag. "Hide it, girlie," he whispered. "It's some very old jewelry that belonged to my mother. Give it to Miss Sophronia at Christmas from me." He patted my arm. We went inside and he took down the sign with the lady's high lace shoe painted on it and put it on the wagon seat. He climbed in the wagon, picked up the reins. "Maya-Ling, Maya-Ling," he called. It was the most musical sound I'd ever heard used to call a cat. She answered him instantly. She mewed and jumped up in the wagon seat beside him. He clucked to the horse, and they were off. I waited not only until they were out of sight, but until I could no longer hear the creak of the wagon wheels and the clop-clop of horses' hooves. And then I turned and ran. Chink said, "Wait a minute." Doddle said, "You don't understand." I stopped running just long enough to shout at them, "You both stink. You stink like dead bats. You and your goddamn Miss Muriel. And thus endeth the story. Well, y'all, that's it. That is the end of Miss Muriel. So my hypothesis, my theory was incorrect. We still don't quite know the little girl's name. We've only seen her called Sugar. And the Miss Muriel part of it, despite the earlier anecdote about Aunt Frankie throwing Miss in front of her name on the rare occasions that she says it, the Miss Muriel story indicates that it was called that because the story that we read was called that because of this particular brand of cigarillos or cigars that somebody tried to buy. What I find, and I definitely, please put all of your thoughts and questions, go ahead and flood the comments now with your thoughts and questions, because I want to read through all of those and discuss this story with you a little bit with the remaining time that we have. What I am struggling with as I look at this, there's something that as a reader got me right away, and that was a decided style change. Prior to this, we weren't getting a lot of second person writing. That is to say, we weren't getting a lot of references to us as the reader, or a lot of wall breaking, what we would call in television or film, fourth wall breaking. We weren't getting a lot of that. The characters were doing what they were doing. The narrator was telling her story without being conscious of the fact that she was writing the story. In this second half, and it's weird because there is no, in the story itself, there is no part one, part two break. I literally went for half the story and I inserted an artificial break so that we could cover this story without having to, hang on a second, I'm trying to adjust the lighting. Boom. Put that one back on. All right. So that we could cover the story and not have to bypass it simply because it's too long. So that was an artificial break that I put in the story. And yet the story seemed to naturally take a stylistic shift. There were a couple of things that happened. One, I started seeing the references to her writing the story, which we didn't have before. So that was a little bit interesting. Then I started noticing, and I don't know how many of you caught it, there was so much more repetition in the second half. Lines were repeated back to back, right behind, like literally said and then said again. And it happened on multiple occasions. Yeah. Like the one where I was like, okay, this is like the fourth time was hang on, I want to find it for you all. And see, if I marked up my books, I would be able to find it, but I ain't gonna mark up my books. Just not gonna happen. It was I can't find it right now because the pages all start to look alike. I'll probably have it and be able to cover it by the time we get to the after story. But there was a new pattern of repetition, and it was quite deliberate. It was happening in the dialogue, and it was happening within the narrative, and I just found that really, really interesting. And I don't know what made the author decide at that point in the story to kind of shift, but it shifted. Also, the story itself overall seemed to take on it took a different path. It seemed to meander a little bit. Did anybody else get that? In the first half of the story, what we read last Thursday, it really seemed to be taking us someplace. The introductions of characters seemed deliberate. It was ramping up. And then in this half of it, things just sort of happened. And I don't quite know why. I'm not saying that I'm dissatisfied with it, but I am going to spend some time reading the entire story all in one mass to see if I still feel that shift in energy. But yeah, it was wild. Let me get to some of you guys' comments and then we can talk some. Okay. Lisa Bobbitt asked the question that's on everybody's mind. Has jumping in the air and clicking one's heels ever earned a man a yes? Listen, I'm glad you asked that question, Lisa. When I was a young buck in my 20s, back in my clubbing days, that's how I pulled all the honeys. I would pull all the honeys. I would jump in the air, click my heels 3 times, and if that didn't impress them, I'd reach in my pocket and throw out a handful of me Lucky Charms right on the floor. Just like, boom. Is this what you're after? Because kids was always after me Lucky Charms. That's the only reason I can think of to jump in the air and click your heels 3 times. If you're not in the Nutcracker, why are you doing this? Why? 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 What? I don't. It, maybe you can chalk it up to it was a different time, but I'm legit trying to understand what makes a man think, okay, she want to play. She don't think she want none. She don't think she want none of this here. Well, hold up. Wait. What I show? Wait, what I show? What I can do though? Hold up, right quick. Like who thought that was a good idea? Lisa says it didn't work then, and it wouldn't work now. But she don't know my life. She don't know how I used to get down back in the year. They called me lucky. That's what they called me. Mr. Beamish. So I accept and understand there's no sympathy for Mr. Beamish throughout the story. And really, I'm fascinated by how much he got to habitually line step. Angel Monique says, if Mr. Beamish don't carry his ass, he been on my nerves since part 1. Agreed. What in the hell? Like, seriously, bro, what do you need? What do you need? How do you need this told to you? Even like just read the room. And it's a lot of, like Latricia says, no means no, because there's an arrogance to this, and there's an entitlement to this that makes for some of the most interesting parts of the story for me, which is that the only person willing to check this man on his entitlement is this little girl, Sugar, I guess. We don't know her name. I have to go back and see if I somehow missed it, but you would think that at some point they would refer to her by name. I can't find it. Lisa asks, are there no age-appropriate widows in town that Mr. Beamish could court instead? Absolutely. I'm sure there are, but he's on that I likes you and I want you. Yeah. So we see the dad, and I think Angela answers Lisa's question. They're not Ansophonia. That's what it really comes down to. We see the dad finally get upset. And while it's interesting to see him finally get mad, it's also kind of like, bruh, what did it take for you to actually finally get mad? But what was really interesting was how his wife shut him down. Like, you were finally mad, and you're explaining what your thoughts are on these men. But did she ask you? But did she ask you how you felt about it? You're just volunteering this opinion. Now, I can understand dude having an opinion about these dudes coming in and out of his store, in and out of his backyard, all of that, and maybe. But ultimately, that's just that's her concern. That's hers. There seems to be some question as to what it is about Sophronia that they make malts and milkshakes at the pharmacy. They make malts and milkshakes. If you remember from part 1, Mr. Beamish sits down and he has one at the ice cream counter. And I dare say that it's her milkshake that brings all the boys to the yard. Their life is better than yours. That's right. It's better than yours. But I think Angela Lee really hits it. In the first half, we do get such a magnificent description of Sophronia and how beautiful she is. Yeah, when Beamish like scoops her up and is telling her he loves her, like I was shocked and appalled and aghast and upset. And then we get to the part where she seems to nuzzle in closer, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, am I misreading this? How I really didn't know how to feel about that. I was like, what in the hell's is going on? Why does she feel that kind of close to him? But yeah, they ran this dude out of town. So this transgression of this old poor white man putting his hands on and being far too familiar with this regal black woman is effectively what gets him run out of town. And this is an all white town, and this is the one black family in this all white town. Now they have the privilege of wealth, and they could be passing apparently. Uh the uncles, who are not, only one of them is an uncle, apparently they are not, they're forced into passing, because they're woke but passing, I guess. I'm going to go back and kind of get a little bit more of a sense of their story. um but yeah, this family is running the white man out of town, which is bananas. um really fascinated by, and I want to learn more about Ann Petry's life growing up, because we know that she grew up in a town very much like this, that she grew up middle class, that her family had money, they did well for themselves, all things considered. So I'm wondering, like, is this quasi biographical? Could it really have gone down this way in an enclave this small? um Angel suggests that they jacked him up, and I'm guessing that that's where that limp came from. um and then she notes that he still calls her girly, and he called Sophronia girly, called her girly in his proposal, which I guess between that and jumping and clicking his heels, he thought he had it. I mean, what do you want, woman? I called you girly. I clicked my heels. I put on my floppy hat. I gave you my lucky charms. What do you want? Women, man, they don't know what they want. Um, about the tonal change, Latricia suggests that maybe it reflects the writer taking a break while writing. It's altogether possible. I'm just curious. I'm going to invest in reading more of this author's works because I want to get a sense of the style, and we'll absolutely bring this book back sometime later in this season so that we can read another couple of stories from it and kind of get a feel. While we're talking about it, though, this book is available, Miss Muriel and Other Stories by Ann Petry. You can find it at a local black bookstore, and we're going to give you a link to one of the ones that we support. um Akanke said that she loves how our narrator described her father's laugh. It was actually described even better in part one, and I was hoping for some echo of that, something to come back. But the description here was interesting, but it didn't have the richness and the depth. I found it interesting how consistent she was in describing not Jono, but Doddle's voice. Buttery, buttery rich, buttery rich, buttery rich. She kept saying that. Part of me wanted her to expound and kind of give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more layer. I think variety kind of helps you wrap your head around it if you're going to use a metaphor. Buttery is such an individual metaphor. Whatever your idea of butter is, that's it. I would like to have seen other metaphors give it shape, but I found it interesting and fascinating that she was so consistent with it. Um, that it really did give me, while I didn't really get a sense of the voice, what I got was a sense of, this is a voice that is fairly consistent. It's not an air, it's not a put on, it's just how he sounds. Um, let's see, what else did we see? Judy Lee asks if Mr. Beamish had a limp earlier in the story. I don't recall him having a limp, but if he did, I find it interesting that the author here made a point to point it out in a way that suggested that it was surprising to her. The way that she called out the limp um, made it feel new, made it feel very new. Lisa suggests that marrying Sophronia would have been a come up for Mr. Beamish, but he was probably arrogant enough to think his whiteness would be a come up for her. All of that. Amen. Truth, truth, truth. Buttery Rich can go so many gorgeous places. I wish she had gone further. I suppose it could. I don't know what that means, but I suppose it could. So yeah, y'all, this was our story. This is what we got out of Miss Muriel and Other Stories. And this brings us to our time. It's just past 11:15, and we like to try and close out every episode of Storytime with Julian around this time. So thank you so very much for coming and spending this time with me. Thank you for finishing out the story. I appreciate it. I want to remind you all that English Brown Winery is still helping us get down. I'm going to have another order coming soon because I really enjoy that blackberry wine. But the code is still available. If you use the code STWJ, you'll save 10% on your order. So please don't forget to do that and support English Brown Winery. They're good friends of the show, and I like them. So yeah. What else did I want to say? Hold on, I want to make sure that I remind you all to follow us on the various socials. And listen, I've been saying this for a couple of weeks. I'm just going to keep reminding you all because it does my heart good. Couple of things. One, when you do this, let people know you did this. Like help us grow, help this community grow, help this effort grow by spreading the word and sharing it. And I don't just mean like, hey, this thing exists, check it out. I mean, like, if you heard a story that you really liked, tell people where you learned about the story. Tell people, I heard this great story, had it read to me, learned about this author that I never heard of, Ann Petry, and she had some absurdly progressive Black folk in her story that were saying the kind of things that a lot of Black folk are seem to be scared to say now. And you need to check her out. Like, it's great that you share the page. I love that you share the page. My new request is that you share the experience. Whatever you get from this, whatever this does for you that makes you come in, as often as you do, whether it's week after week or twice every week or every once in a while, whatever it is that you get from this that makes you come here, tell a friend about that. Tell them about that part, that this is why you come and this is what you get out of it. And here's what you learned. And here's what you got to hear today. And this is what it sounded like. And this is what made it dope. Let people know what's going on here. Share the experience of Storytime with Julian. And if it's been a gift to you, then I ask you pay that gift forward. And understand that each and every one of you under the sound of my voice, you guys are a gift to me. Like, this is the best thing that has come out of this pandemic situation for me is the growth of this community and what's come forth from it. I appreciate you all so much. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on the Twitters, follow us on Clubhouse. We do this now on Saturdays on Clubhouse. So on Clubhouse, the format's a little bit different. And of course, it's all audio, but I know half of y'all don't even have the screen on when you got this on anyway. So I'm not even tripping about that. But do check us out on Clubhouse and make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check out the things that we do there. There's plenty of great content. YouTube is the only place where you can find the back episodes. When they are here on Facebook, I take them down after about a week. So if you missed something, go back and look for it. Angel Monique says that her wine is on its way. She ordered something from English Brown. She's so excited. She's going to order some more this evening. That's what's up. That's what's up. I love to hear it. I love to hear it. Latricia, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank y'all for coming out. Please do subscribe. And if you want to support the work of Storytime with Julian, you can tip your griot at hashtag Storytime Julian. That's $ Storytime Julian with Cash App. Everything that you donate goes to either the subscription that we use to stream this or buying new books. And it is much appreciated. You can find Miss Muriel and Other Stories at harrietsbookshop.com and be on the lookout. We're going to be doing some cross promotion with them on a couple of other projects real soon. I can't think of anything else that I need to say. I want to say Thank you. I appreciate you. I love you. I'm so glad you guys came out and spent this time. Um, I'm not over you. I'm not. I'll never be over you. I don't know who wrote that. I've been hacked. Um, it looks like I've missed a few of the comments here because now I'm seeing that somebody said, sir. I'm pretty sure that's when I was throwing Lucky Charms out my pockets. And Kamisha Umstead, somebody sent Kamisha some ointment because they made her behind itch, and we don't want Kamisha in that kind of discomfort. So y'all look out for each other. Make sure that y'all take care of your sis. Don't leave her booty itching because of this. And apparently I'm officially done. So let me go ahead. And apparently the milkshake comment is the one that threw. I didn't see all these comments earlier. I don't know why these are just popping up. Now I'm now I'm cracking up. Anyway, y'all, thank you so much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed. I look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday. I'll let you know probably sometime tomorrow or early Thursday what we're going to be reading. But either way, come back, and don't just come back. Come back and bring a friend, all right? Do that for me. Do that for yourself. Do that for them, okay? That's it. This has been Storytime with Julian, and I'll see you soon. Peace.